Okay, I will start my speech in three, two, one. I see no reason to believe that cognition, understanding, and sympathy is something that can only be realized within the flesh and blood that makes up our brains, as opposed to computers. I think the enormous advances in AI that we have already seen over the past decade should make you highly confident that this is going to be capable of being a shoulder to cry on, of giving genuinely good advice. That is not only good for the many people who do not feel that they have alternatives that they can talk to, but I think it is also going to enable those people not just to rely upon the AI, but to ease this transition towards talking to other people, to give them advice about how to do that. The first thing I want to characterize, just in terms of the frame, is who is using this and for what. Crucial piece of context. There are many reasons why people are disposed not to rely on this in the first place. At that point, it is highly likely that the people who are using this are doing so because they feel that they need to and that they don't have alternatives. What are those reasons? Here are three. A, there is a basic biological drive towards connection with other human beings. It's something that we are disposed towards. That is not to say that it's the only kinds of beings that we can feel connected with, but it is something that I think to a certain extent is a default, and so probably is what people start off with until they've gotten more comfortable using this stuff. Secondly, there are social narratives against the use of AI, particularly for this purpose, because it's often thought to be something that is a uniquely human thing that you should be relying on other humans to do. It's narratives like saying like relying on this kind of stuff is weird, that it's risky and dangerous, that people who are doing this are in some sense sad. All of these narratives are driven to a large extent by fear and like lack of understanding of AI. And as the of these uses happens, that's probably likely to continue. But I also think three, there's also just like a lack of understanding of a lot of people of what AI can do. There's often a great sense of like fear associated with using this stuff, especially when you're talking about sensitive topics. The implication of this, and I would
Right.
notice that these reasons don't vanish with the rise, even if they reduce to some extent. What that means is that the people who are using it, even if it is a small number, probably are using it because they have to, and I trust their judgment on that. But I also think, just like basically, you can opt out of this if you don't feel that it's helping you. That already disposes this to have benefits. In terms of what you're using this for, notice that there is a spectrum of uses here. There are some people who really lack alternatives that are probably going to be, like, to a very large extent, reliant on this for many of their emotional needs. Other people are going to use it for specialized things that they don't feel others in their life can do, i.e., they still talk to their wife about having a bad day, but if there's some things that they are particularly insecure about, worried about, or for whatever reason are not comfortable to talk with their loved ones about, that is what they use AI for. The second thing I want to prove in terms of characterization is why this likely is good advice and good to talk to. Aside from the simple fact that people who do not feel that it is good advice or good to talk to don't think it's helping them probably opt out of it in the first place. Three reasons why it's good. One, there's enormous investment in LLMs, not just for this purpose, but also in general, given the huge like transformative potential that this stuff has across a wide variety of industries. There's billions being plugged into it. I also note, second, this technology improves with the rise. As data sets get larger and as programmers over a process of trial and error are able to get feedback from customers to perform tests to realize what is
Right.
working and what is not, the people who are, this probably is likely to improve over time. No, thank you. But finally, there's also just a large amount of regulation that's going to be very likely here. Look, if this is giving shit advice and somebody kills themselves and this goes wrong, that is something that regulators are going to crack down on extremely hard, given how like salient of a story this is, how much backlash there is likely to be over this, given the fear of AI that I've described. But it's also an absolutely enormous lawsuit waiting to happen. At that point, successful companies are like the ones that outcompete their competitors are likely to be the ones that can prove to the government, to regulators, to courts that their AI is safe to use. At that point, I think there are great incentives to make this work. How does this help people? The first thing I want to talk about is the direct use of this AI and why that's good for people with a lack of alternatives. Many people do not feel that they have, or at least are not willing to, open up to people for psychological support. I think, firstly, just in terms of therapy access, that is obviously something that is very limited. It is expensive. There are only so many therapists to go around. And even when somebody in theory could access them, there's often a large amount of fear about doing that, opening up to somebody in that setting. And I would note similarly, opening up to loved ones is often incredibly scary. It's really difficult for many people to talk about the fact that you are struggling, the fact that you are struggling, to admit that a lot of people feel like opening up and admitting that it means an admission of weakness. It's difficult often to talk about your insecurities or to talk about the conflicts that you're having with your loved ones. You're very unlikely going to be able to talk to your wife, for instance, about fights that you're having with her. I think AI is very different right here. Because it's not somebody that you are already connected to, the judgment of the AI is something that you are not likely to fear to nearly as large an extent.
Right.
It's true that there's going to be some amount of connection with the AI, given all the reasons that I've described, but it isn't going to be nearly as much as the extent to which you would fear, for instance, going out and opening up to your loved ones. At that point, I think many people using this AI are likely to do so for things that they would not be willing or able to do otherwise. To talk about conflict, to talk about insecurities in a space where they're not worried that one of their loved ones is going to judge them for that. If the alternative to this is a large amount of isolation, of ruminating over these problems, of feeling trapped within them and unable to open up, to express how you are feeling, to feel understood, that is going to make people awful. Even if this is not a perfect solution, it is certainly preferable to that. I'll take a POI now.
Yeah, so when you have a problem with a person, how do you solve it? Do you talk to the person and actually resolve it, or talk to the robot?
I think this neatly links into the next part of my speech. In terms of how I think this eases your relationships with other people, I would notice that there are probably very few people that are solely relying on the AI just for this. As I mentioned earlier, it's a spectrum of use cases. But even for the people who are, I think the AI is probably likely to encourage and to assist you in reaching out to other people. So to the extent that the AI is not perfect as a means for getting support, I think use of the AI helps you to do that. Why? I think firstly, the AI is very likely to encourage you to go out and reach out to other people, right? The simple reason for this being that, like, to the extent that there are large amounts of like narratives within the data set that the AI is trained upon, suggesting that human connection is important, suggesting that AI is not perfect for all uses, it's probably likely to encourage you to do that, to tell you that you're probably not going to be judged as much as you think you are, to emphasize the benefits that you could gain from that. They might respond to this by saying that there are commercial incentives for the AI companies to like have the AI tell you to only keep using the AI. But I think all of the lawsuit and regulatory pressures that I described earlier address that. So I think firstly, this probably helps you to reach out in instances where that would be good for you. But I think it also better enables you to do that. It can give you advice on how to have these difficult conversations if you are struggling. It can, and I think also just like to the extent that you've already vented to the AI and have felt understood and your feelings are mitigated to a certain extent, it's probably easier to reach out for all these reasons proposed. I'm sorry if that was a bit messy. This Wi-Fi cutout sucked.
No worries. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for that excellent speech and call upon the Leader of Opposition to open the case for Opposition Bench.
Can I be seen and heard?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll take POIs in the chat exclusively, please. Thank you. What happened before the rise? I think people used LLMs to do things like psychological research things like therapists that they want to go to, and the most vulnerable people were still looking for advice and things like that. The rise is characterized by the sheer amount of people that are now using it for things like conversations and things like advice that would otherwise have other comparatives that they're able to go to. What are these comparatives? Firstly, talking to friends and family, as opening government discussed, i.e., I do think a lot of people have a lot of friends and family around them that are accessible, given the very biological drive towards connection that people have. I would posit that this means that a lot of people generally tend to have these friends and things like that. But the second thing is things like hotlines and other free services that already exist that are run by NGOs that people can turn to in the instance that they feel uncomfortable talking to these individuals in the first place. The second comparative is if you have none of these options, you can talk to yourself. You can have conversations with yourself, or you can do things like journal and all of these things. I would note that people have been doing this for eons to alleviate their psychological harms and things like that. Consequently, this is a unique way through which you would get better introspection on our side of the house. Note, I will evaluate this later. The third thing is checking into therapy, but I would notice on both sides of the house, the most egregiously affected by psychological trauma and issues are likely to check into therapy on either side of the house. What we will prove going into our case is that the advice you get preceding therapy is actually worse at the point at which you engage in the AI within the first place, engaging in the best case in opening government. Cool. Why are the LLMs bad and why are they over relied upon? Firstly, the LLM is likely to tell you exactly what you want to hear and things that are validating. Empirically, this is just true. If you ever ask ChatGPT, like, am I enough? It's obviously going to tell you yes and things like that. But I'll give a few reasons for this. The first thing is the very reason that opening government discusses, which is that firms that run these LLMs necessarily don't want their LLMs giving out really, really bad advice or potentially risky advice that could be good for these people within the first place. I.e., they teeter towards making this advice validating or program it as such that this advice is validating, insofar as they don't want the people killing themselves and they have an expensive lawsuit on their hands within the first place. The second thing is that they're usually programmed on an aggregation of information that already exists in the sphere of the internet and things like that. The problem here is that there's an oversaturation of advice that already tells you a thing like you are enough and all of those things, and those basic psychological remedies that exist in bullshit self-help blogs and things like that. Consequently, what this means is that the likely programming of this AI, even if it has access to the most information and it is developing at the pace that opening governments talk about, is likely to aggregate all of these things within the first place. The third thing is that you get a general race to the middle in terms of what it is likely to address, insofar as it is risk averse for the reasons that I talked about in the first incentive. Consequently, it is likely to just validate you and not give you useful advice in the first place. The second thing is that it gives you broadly useless advice insofar as it doesn't understand your emotional trauma and it doesn't understand the physical cues that you otherwise would have if you're interacting with a real human. Consequently, this means that it doesn't understand the nuances of the emotions that you necessarily feel, and so consequently is likely to, insofar as it is risk averse, give you something really bland and boring. But even in the instances where it gives you something more adventurous or cool, it's likely to be misaligned insofar as it doesn't understand these cues. The third thing is that LLMs don't ask you questions. And the reason for this is very simple. The entire purpose of these LLMs within the first place is so people can do research and people can generate the things that they want to generate, insofar as that is the incentives that humans have to create LLMs within the first place. Consequently, you don't get your own introspection to the point at which this LLM is not asking you questions going forward. Note that most of these LLMs are programmed for a million other uses, not just psychological uses. So just saying that there's going to be competition which makes it necessarily better in the psychological realm is not enough to overthrow the broad incentives it has to be largely answer-oriented as opposed to question-oriented. Consequently, you don't get to understand your own issues at the point at which it doesn't ask you these questions in the first place. Why is it over-relied upon, contrary to what opening government says? The first thing is that it fronts like a human. So that is to say that even if you're initially suspicious when you're going into this realm within the first place, it's actually pretty good at using things like human terms, saying things like hello, saying things like bro, and all of these things, insofar as AI firms want it to have that human connection, so you keep going to that AI as opposed to going to search engines and things like that. The second thing is that there's marketing around a lot of these LLMs that say things like it is your AI partner or it is your AI, so it'd be specifically catered towards you in the first place. There are two implications of this. The first thing is that you perceive that you'll have a more personalized relationship with this AI in the first place, like, see the Snapchat AI and all of these things. The second thing is that it aggregates, even if it is true, it aggregates your own information going forward, over and over again. So consequently, at the first time where it gives you validating information and you validate that validating information, it will keep giving you validating information going forward and things like that. The third thing is that I would posit a lot of people actually really trust AI a lot, and the reason for this is that there's a lot of suspicion around things like what other humans could necessarily do to you, insofar as their narratives like you ought not trust other people with your close information and things like that. So consequently, AI is actually a tool that a lot of people go to insofar as they trust it a lot. Why is this a tipping point in crowding out the comparatives? The first thing is a lot of people that are psychologically burdened don't want to burden other people with their psychological burdens within the first place. So they don't want to go to a therapist. They don't want to call someone on a free hotline. They don't want to talk to their friends insofar as they feel like their friends will end up being mad at them. The second thing is that you end up not wanting to self-introspect in a lot of instances at the point at which you have access to this AI, insofar as you don't trust yourself to self-introspect as well as this AI is able to do to you within the first place. The third thing is that you see it as an easy fix. You see it as an easy out, and so consequently, when it gives you short-term solutions, you keep going back on that thing in the first place. So even if you have access to other narratives like opening government necessarily talks about, you don't opt into those things insofar as they're often more long-termist, and you would rather defer to the short-termist things that the AI tells you. Before I talk about why the comparatives are more desirable, I'll take closing if they have anything.
So you know how sometimes when you try to talk to a friend and vent about stuff and they just try to offer unsolicited advice the whole time, does that actually give you solvency on your issues?
So the first thing is friends often don't give you unsolicited advice because they know it is bad to do so in the way that you and I wouldn't give each other unsolicited advice. I think the second thing is that most people tend to interact with these interactions by prefacing the fact that there's probably no solution to this thing in the first place, if it is true for those people. The third thing is that often this unsolicited advice is just really useful, or at least comparatively more useful than what the AI gives you. Why are the comparatives better? Firstly, they better address the core issues, they address the emotional turmoil that you have, and they ask you questions to figure out what more granularly what the problem with you is within the first place. This leads to more things like introspection, but more things like mutual understanding about what the problem is actually within the first place, whereas AI doesn't ask you these questions ever. The second thing is that you don't just get validating information, but you get information that could necessarily be good towards you, or at least help ameliorate your situation within the first place. Things like the things like self-help that you necessarily engage with at the point at which you engage with people that have had similar experiences and things like that. The third thing is that it inhibits introspection insofar as you don't engage in things things like journaling or actually talking to yourself insofar as you defer to the AI to be able to doing these things in the first place. The fourth thing is that it just crowds out the other free resources that you do have. Note that I would posit that a lot of people would defer to these free resources like the hotlines that are set up to help with these things. Note that given that these LLMs are an easier fix, they turn to these which give you worse information. There's a clear opening opposition.
I'd like to thank the Leader of Opposition for that very fine speech and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for government bench.
Thank you. Just one sec. Please, sec. The amount of times that the Leader of Opposition says the word other alternatives, they haven't really given us many that actually seem to work for people, because the things they talk about are things like going to read a self-help book or, I don't know, talking to your friends, which you've explained to you some people may not have. So I don't think they've actually given us realistic alternatives for people who would actually be accessing the AI. At the point at which they do this, I think they lose the debate. But I'll rebut what they give us anyway. Firstly then, is AI actually good at doing things? What do they tell you on this? They basically say that like it's not going to give you good advice because it doesn't cause you to introspect, etc. And like this is really bad because introspection is for some reason important. They don't actually tell us why. Why do we think that the AI is likely to give you good advice and tell you good things? I think the first thing is that validating advice that they tell you it's going to give you might actually be good in a lot of places, and is in a lot of places what people genuinely need. Because at the point at which I don't want to talk to my friends about something, I don't want to talk to my family about something, and journaling isn't working, the best sort of advice I can get is probably just, you are doing all right, you're like doing your best, you are a good person. I do think this is what a lot of people need in order to take the next step to go and talk to other people and open up about their issues, because a lot of the time the reason why they don't is specifically because they feel invalidated. The second thing they say is that it's because it like doesn't understand nuance, so that's why it's bad for you. First comment on this is the alternatives they bring us also don't understand nuance. They say that you should introspect, you should journal, you should call a hotline, you should go online. If I'm calling a hotline, which we tell you they probably won't do because it's got lots of stigma around it, you think that these are people who would be better spent dealing with more serious things, like people in actual crisis, not like me who just wants a friend to talk to. We think that these things are probably going to have like, you're not going to talk to them very long when you do access them. The second alternative, which is just like talking to yourself or journaling, you're not going to get any more nuance than you would already have if you're just talking to yourself and thinking to yourself. I don't know how that's a substitute. I don't know how that's a fix. And again, if you're going online and reading self-help blogs, that's also not getting me nuance on my specific circumstance because I can't even input it in. On the comparative, even if AI isn't as good as providing nuance as my actual friends, which it's kind of untrue that it wouldn't, that your friend, it's unproven that friends would actually be giving you good nuanced advice because they're probably likely to take your side anyway in the same way that AI would. I don't think it actually does need to be nuanced. It just needs to be someone you can talk to and feel like you actually have a friend. These are the sorts of people who actually are accessing the AI. But also, with the rise of the AI, with the rise of these AIs, I don't think it's necessarily true that the AI is going to be particularly bad at doing these sorts of things. For instance, if X% of the, like 20% of the ChatGPT usage is people trying to get advice and talk to them like it's a friend, probably ChatGPT develops to ask you questions back so you can get some sort of introspection, so you can get some sort of nuance. There's a market incentive to do this. Therefore, I think AI probably is kind of good. I don't think the alternatives they give really work, so that argument doesn't really work. The second thing they say is that AI is going to be over relied on because it competes with other good things like your friends, and like competing with like the a market competition isn't a good enough reason to. The first response I have to this is that I think like your friends and real people, if you do have them, probably still do want to talk to you, and they're probably still going to call you a loser, even if it's somewhat normalized if you're just sat at home talking to the chatbot all the time. So I don't think it's true that you completely substitute. Also, there are a lot of things that you can't efficiently substitute, like the fact that the AI can't give you a hug, the AI can't like, I don't know, like physically be with you, the AI can't sit down and eat a meal with you. Meaning, I don't think it's true that people are going to substitute it to a massively harmful extent. But in the circumstances where they do become over-reliant on the AI, I actually think that's completely fine, and we're happy to bite that bullet. Because we tell you the sorts of people who do want to have the conversation with the AI all the time are people who genuinely haven't experienced the other thing being better, who don't have friends who want to talk to them about their issues, who live in a circumstance where maybe the people around them are not people they feel comfortable sharing issues with, like maybe they don't want to come out to them, maybe they don't want to tell them about the like mental health issues they've been struggling with because they feel like it's a burden. We think that AI probably helps you get closer to being open about speaking about these things, and in the meantime, it's probably a pretty good substitute for a friend. But at the end of the day, we think there's likely to be pretty good regulation either way for the reasons that Fraser gives you that goes unresponded to, because because of the fact that people are generally very concerned about mental health. AI is a massively salient issue, and when it does rise, people do probably become somewhat concerned about it. We do think the governments are going to try to say to AI firms at the point at which someone does do something tragic, like commit suicide as a result of talking to the AI, or there's a massive rise of young people who are becoming increasingly isolated in our worst case because of the AI, we think these things will probably be fixed. We don't think it's a massive issue. We think they're going to have to bring us a stronger alternative of what these people can go to in their next speech if they want to beat us in this round. Moving on then, why do we think that AI is generally going to be intrinsically good for the people who are using it, bringing positive material that competes with what they've given us? I think we've characterized you pretty clearly the circumstances in which people are going to choose to use the AI. Couple instances when you need to offload things, when you feel like you can't be understood by the people around you because you can't share the bits of your identity that you want to be talking about, or when you can't yet talk to others because you don't think you understand your own thoughts yet. We think that for people who have who would otherwise wouldn't have other places to go, this is particularly important, i.e. they can't access counselling, they don't have available friends, or actually they feel that it would be very bad for their friend if they were to start venting at them, if they were to start basically trauma dumping on them in the way that feels like it would be helpful to them. We do think it's important for people to be seen, but not at the cost of others. We think people are generally quite good at recognizing this, but the alternative, and I think what people who don't talk to the AI, sorry, I don't talk to AI, it sounds like I'm really passionate about this, but people who don't talk to the AI in the status quo probably just sit there, ruminate, stuff it all up in their head, don't have any introspection, just sit and doom about it, and we think this is significantly worse. But there's also a couple of things that we think AI is able to uniquely do that they cannot get on their side of the house in an effective way without the rise of it. This looks like real-time intervention in things like crisis, because as many times as they tell you the word hotline, it's been shown that people necessarily don't want to be sharing things with someone they feel is another human. That's why you don't get people calling the hotline, but we think they might be talking to the AI at the point at which it feels slightly more unhuman. Before I go on to talk about the other stuff, I'll take closing.
If people fear exposing their insecurities to humans, they instead share their deepest, darkest secrets to the AI. Don't you think it's dangerous for companies to know the most intimate aspects of you?
I preempted this. You're going to basically say that, oh, it's really bad because then they get the data. But I don't think you realize that the companies have this data anyway. This sounds really crazy, but I did a year of sociology. And basically, there's this thing where companies are getting all your data anyway. Every time you text your friends on WhatsApp or Instagram or messages and telling them your secrets, companies are getting this data in some way. I don't know why this is necessarily harmful, but because they're not going to do anything with your data. I don't know what they're going to do. You're going to have to prove an actual impact or something they can do that's going to harm you. But I think probably they have your data anyways. And if it's between that and you having no friends and being really sad and maybe inflicting harm on yourself, I'd rather the company have my data than have that worst case thing. But why do we think it's most important when you can use it in conjunction with other things? And why do we think this is our most low burden impact in the debate? Because in our worst case, when people do use it at the same time as having friends, it does take up more of their time than you think it should. I think it actually makes your relationship with other people significantly better because of the fact that you learn what having a good conversation about something looks like. You learn what things don't work for you, and you're able to share things with an AI before you have to share with your friends, which we think helps you bring down your barriers. At the end of the day, we think it's pretty good to talk to an AI if you have no friends. Lots of people have no friends, therefore OG.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that very fine speech and call upon the DLO to continue the debate for Op Bench and close off top half.
Am I audible?
Yes.
All right. Ask POIs in chat. I will have it open so I can get the POIs. I'm going to first explain why the comparative is effective. Secondly, why LLMs are bad, and third, why you're likely to have an over-reliance responding to a lot of the government case on this. Firstly, on the comparative, note that the comparative looks like three things. Firstly, accessing therapy services. They say that this is expensive and not necessarily available. One, I think the proliferation of mental health talk means that there's been a proliferation of mental health services to match the demand of these services existing in the status quo. This looks like a couple of things. Firstly, you now have charities existing who offer mental health services to individuals, removing the barriers to access that opening government talks about. Secondly, the readily availability of hotlines means that individuals are able to get that immediacy of impact, meaning that they can immediately talk to individuals who need them. Third, you have the proliferation of things like student discounts on BetterHelp or subsidization of mental health services by universities, which means that there's another access pathway to accessing these services in the first instance. Fourth, the competition and increased supply of different services means that they compete on the quality of services and the quality of price, driving down price to make them more attractive to consumers and consumers on the first instance. Fifth, the proliferation of online support groups and communities and friends means that even if you don't have in-person services that are existing and in-person friends, means that you're much more able to connect with them in the first instance. Second, your social support spheres exist, and why are they likely to give you good advice? Firstly, the proliferation of mental health in the previous decade means that there's immense online discourse on active listening, knowledge of mental health conditions. Since there's a removal of taboo and more discourse, the proliferation of this dialogue that means that people become more aware on how to actively listen to people or become better at providing advice in the first instance. Secondly, you can express to individuals what you need. If you're looking for validation, if you need advice on how to solve a conflict or different ways that which you can attack the problem, it forces you to communicate your objectives, which is really important, because then it then simultaneously forces you to introspect on what things would be more efficacious for you in dealing with your mental health condition at the moment. Third, people know and understand you as an individual, so they know how to respond. They understand your characteristics and have known you for like a long time, which means that they're much more able to give you personalized advice suited to your condition. The fourth thing is that people can clock soft factors. They can see things like your identity, body language, and tone when you're communicating in the way that AI cannot. So they can tell what you're really upset about, what you really mean. If an answer is satisfactory to you, which means the quality of advice gets better because you are unable to express these implicit factors to AI. Fifth, you can talk to multiple friends and aggregate solutions from different angles. This is important because ChatGPT gives you a singular perspective, which is unlikely to be granularized, and avoid controversy for the reason Aymaan says, which means on the comparative, you're trying to aggregate different forms of advice, which means that the quality of advice that you get, quality of consultations that you have is necessarily better. But the last thing I say is that the rise of alternatives means that you are individually able to seek out help. Well, there's online information on coping mechanisms and what's working for you. You try and test various approaches over accepting AI generalizations of what you should do. It forces you to introspect and critically evaluate why you're receptive to X approach over Y. And this means that the quality of your services necessarily becomes better. What they say this is good for people is because people have a fear of opening up. And I want to respond to this case in relation to why there's likely to be an over-reliance. They say that there's like unlikely to be an over-reliance, and you only use this when you have a fear of opening up. I think the first thing is you have the capacity to rant to your friends and write down on a piece of like in your journal or on these instances of how you're feeling, and you can look at these works and coalesce. The second thing is if we prove that the advice that these services give you is bad, we'd rather have people not do it and not open up. Insofar as then the harms of opening up to ChatGPT becomes a lot worse. But lastly, there's just other ways you can access good information, as I've already discussed. Let's then discuss over-reliance. The first thing, there's a couple of reasons why this over-reliance necessarily happens. The first is that because opening up is hard, emotional, and uncomfortable, this gives you a way to bypass the struggles that you would have in order to have these difficult conversations in the first instance, which means that people perceive this as an easier solution, given that the weight of mental health in discussing these things is incredibly costly, which means that it's more accessible to resort to these in the first place, and all the reasons that OG says about how you're afraid to put things on people. Second, there's an immediacy effect. Note that whenever you're in a spiral, you can seek this out in the first instance, which means that it's far more easier and literally at your fingertips in order to use. And as a consequence, you begin to return to it. As a consequence, this removes the taboo or any sort of fear because you become so much normalized and acquainted to using it in the first place. But lastly, in terms of emotional burnout, it is really emotionally difficult to repeat your experiences now that you've talked about it to AI and used it as your first resort. And so you're unlikely to report it to your friends now and have talk about it. What this means is that even if people want to seek out human connections, these factors end up overcoming the human connections based mechanisms that necessarily exist in the first instance. Even if they say that you cannot substitute human connection, you have less of incentive to expose to your friends that you're using AI because of the fact that you don't necessarily want to be don't want to be shamed, and you're less impacted by this stigma whenever you continue to rely on it more and more. The final thing I want to discuss is whether LLMs are good at giving advice. Their idea here is that validating advice is fine because sometimes people need this. You can access validation symmetrically, but the flip is that when AI doesn't challenge you, this is bad because firstly, validating is dangerous if you're genuinely in the wrong in the situation. Secondly, it doesn't expose you to new levels of thinking. But third, you're just unable to clock changes, not able to understand how you make a difference. It means that the quality of your life doesn't become better. I'll take closing government.
Yes. So on over-reliance, kids from a young age are already increasingly over-relying on artificial intelligence. At least now they have the stuff integrated and are able to understand their emotions and feelings.
Yeah, I'm going to explain why AI just has less of a capacity to do this. The first thing is that you're less likely to pursue long-term solutions. And this is because these platforms want to give you an easy fix, some sort of dopamine rush, so you feel like they're actually effective and that this is actually working. This is bad because you don't then consider long-term changes or changes that are really difficult to implement, conversations that are really difficult to have, especially when recovery and these conversations aren't linear and they require a lot of struggle. You're unlikely to do things that require a lot of struggle because AI gives you immediate validation. Second, AI doesn't have the capacity to comprehend or investigate the issue in a bigger picture. You talk about one situation, but I think a therapist, your other individuals on your life would be like, but are you responding to this based on how you were raised? What was your relationship with your mom like? And things like that. So you never respond to issues that you experience on the abstract, which means you're worse in solving your issues and your problems in the first place. The final thing is that AI is trained on determining what the right solution is based on the amount of data that exists for something over understanding whether something is a good or a right solution. Lastly, the type of data that is used is often very generalized. Even if the quality of data gets better, there's still a short-term harm that occurs within this time lag, which means that there's a proliferation of bad advice. All in all, what happens is that mechanisms in the status quo are efficient in dealing with individuals, but at their very worst, you create this validation cycle in which individuals feel unable to clock long-term changes and make beneficial recovery to their mental health. You don't introspect, don't develop coping mechanisms that are better for you. You have worse quality of mental health.
I'd like to thank the DLO for that excellent speech and everyone for it's been a great top half, and call upon the opposition member to continue the case for opposition bench.
Like internet issues before, so if I lag, am I lagging or like is it visible and
At the moment, you're perfectly fine.
Okay, perfect. If I do lag, just like ping me, like scream at me, and I'll stop, and we can start again. I'm going to do three things. Firstly, I'll talk about why there's a culture of opening up in status quo right now. Secondly, I'll talk about privacy and why regulation will never work with regards to privacy and why it's incredibly problematic giving data to things like Plantier and OpenAI, which are your most vulnerable secrets. Thirdly, I'll analytically extend off opening opposition and uniquely talk about why confrontation is much worse, why you get cognitive dissonance because you never get the physical attachment and physical love you need to overcome your issues. Firstly, then, culture of opening up. Uniquely, I want to note, Alishba says she's going to talk about why people start opening up right now. She never gives you reasons as to why the incentives, you have the incentives to actually do that and engage with opening government. I'm going to give you multiple reasons. The first is with regards to your friends uniquely. Many cases, you become close friends with people because you have shared multiple important events in your life with them. This includes like things like being embarrassed, like having embarrassing moments, like very important life instances where it was like very funny for people laughed at you and you feel sad about it, but you shared with them. So you know that they're actually good avenues for you to get catharsis and they will back you all the time. Two, in many cases, they've been there for you previously in your most important life events and given you advice. That is why you're good friends in the first place, right? They've backed you when you've opened up about their sexuality or your life problems. They've given you support and they've supported you through them, even when you haven't been able to be there for them. This means in many cases, you actually have an incentive to open up to them and you aren't really scared because you already have a culture of opening up. That is why your closest friend circle are most likely the people who already know a lot of things about you. Two, this is just a cultural thing that is changing because of social media. Social media has made it much easier to talk about yourself behind a screen because you're just typing shit away and it's much less personal, and that means that you're more likely to open up, right? This looks like millions of people on Reddit asking whether they're an asshole because of a certain instruction they did. Like identifying the fact that there's like incel culture or there's isolated culture, etc. The fact that you opened up about yourself and shared personal details, maybe it's anonymous, but it's to do that in the first place. So there's a culture of opening up and sharing personal details about you because of the rise of social media. Three, with regards to your family members, this is just very intuitive. Your family members have sacrificed for you. They've been there for you. They've spent money for you. They've seen you cry. They've birthed you literally. They're biologically linked to you. So you know that they're actually going to be there for you and support you and take your self-interest into account when they're making decisions. The strategic implication of this analysis means that opening governments margin is incredibly low. I don't know how many people have none of these options. I don't know how many people have no access to therapy either. Because if therapy is as opening opposition says, is becoming more accessible, I don't know why they have access to ChatGPT. Surely you need a laptop. Surely you need internet connection. I don't know why those things are accessible to them as well. So the margin is incredibly unclear in opening government. Secondly, let's talk about privacy. Four things I want to talk about with regards to regulation. Opening opposition just assumes regulation will happen. I'm actually going to explain why regulation is going to be done badly and why it's going to be done in a problematic way where you continue to give bad advice. This bad advice is not going to be oh, kill yourself, but it's going to be marginally bad advice that doesn't solve your structural problems. Four reasons. First, things like OpenAI and like Plantier are million and billion-dollar companies already in the US, where the largest amount of AI development is happening. They are all like in cahoots with Donald Trump. Like regulation has been scrapped. They've been given subsidies. They have an incentive to actually ensure regulation doesn't happen as much, so they can develop most. But two, intuitively with regards to LLMs themselves, you can't regulate it, because the way they develop is by giving them more information and more information, right? That's the reason why ChatGPT is like open source. You have to like give like more and more information and like let it do its thing for it to learn. So intuitively you can't regulate LLMs, because otherwise you like reduce the capacity for it to innovate and capacity for it to develop. But three, in many cases the regulations are incredibly sly. So if you look at things like privacy regulations with regards to Meta, it's in the fine line. You don't even know what you're giving up, because you don't fucking read the rules and regulations. You just sign up because you want to talk to friends. And intuitively this is already happening, because what OG has said, you've used ChatGPT for other things. You've used it for your exam, so you've already consented to it. So with by the point where you're actually going and like giving up your private details, you've already consented to giving up private details away. But fourthly, the rise is what creates trust. Inherently, before the rise, you're already distrustful of technology. You're already distrustful of these companies. But the rise intuitively clashes against that and gives you the incentive to be more trustful. Because the friend is using it. You see the advertisement. You see the companies that are stock rising. You see them shaking hands with the guy like Sam from like OpenAI. This means that it creates the trust for you to opt in the first place. Why is this trust so bad, and why would it be exploited by these companies? Very, very easy reasons. One, it is just as an incentive for them to exploit your vulnerable details. And this manifests in very harmful ways, right? Historically, like metadata with regards to like Cambridge Analytica, given away to other companies and sold off, because it's like $1 billion industry to sell off your data. This data is going to be used to exploit you. This looks like more advertisements, targeted attacks on your identity. But more importantly, I think the big, unique thing with regards to like cyber security is this like creates massive vulnerabilities for your data to be stolen, right? Because anyone who has incentive, like any hacker, is the easiest thing they need to do is like attack one of these like hubs. They get all your vulnerable details. They can like blackmail you, they can exploit you. And the thing is, even if this doesn't happen, the risk of it is so much more higher in their world, because all of the vulnerabilities are in the cloud. So any risk of this going out is just incredibly harmful for these individuals. Let's then talk about the analytical extensions. Firstly, on confrontation, you get conditioned not to do confrontation in their world, not right now. The reason is very simple. Confrontation is very difficult. It actually takes a lot out of you. You get screamed at. You actually get laughed at sometimes. You actually get argued at. The reason why this is important, though, is this is the prerequisite of solving problems. Because if you don't confront someone, you don't understand their perspective. You don't understand why they're going against you and why they're disagreeing with you. The reason what happens in their world is you can control the narrative. Because you type the things out. You actually say what you want. And you craft the stories based on your own preferences and your own preferences. And like the thing is, everyone has their own truth, right? But that not might be the objective truth. That is worse in their world. Their only response here is that, the AI will ask questions. Sure, but it's so much more different when it's your friend, it's your family, it's a person you love. That question is much more deeper, and you can't run away from it, because you can't switch off the laptop and say to fuck off, right? So confrontation is much better. And that is the prerequisite in opening opposition. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if the AI can't learn from conversations, ask deep questions, or understand nuance, then if you have alternatives, you stop using it, no harm done. If it's good, then even if you over-rely on it, why is that a bad thing?
Yeah, but this is an even if case that doesn't exist, right? So then if you are correct, your case doesn't work. That's the case. That's what opposition is running. So the confrontation is important, because that is when you get self-accountability. And that is what the opening opposition is missing. It's unclear as to why you get like accountability. It's not just about introspection. It's actually actively changing your decisions. Secondly, then let's talk about breaking down of social relationships. In their world, you get the advice, it might be good. But the advice might be to hang out with your friends. The problem is when you go and hang out with your friends, you're actually demure. You're muted. You aren't that happy. And you're playing cricket, the friend asks you, don't you want to be here? What's wrong? But you never open up, because that was never part of the problem in the first place. And that's really important, because now the friend is like, oh, he doesn't want to hang out with me anymore. Maybe he doesn't like me as much. This means the interaction is worsened on their world, and that's just really bad. Finally, cognitive dissonance. This happens because physical interaction is essential for you to feel better, even for your psychological issues. When you're crying alone, it feels like shit. But when a person is hugging you and you have a shoulder to cry on, it feels so much better, because you get the psychological affirmation that you are loved, you are involved, there's a person looking out for you. That one alone, and without the physical interaction, you feel a cognitive dissonance. You do this, you feel better, but you don't feel better. You still feel like shit, because you don't have the touch that makes you feel better. You don't have that love. All of these reasons, quite clear, Eoin.
I'd like to thank the opposition member for that very fine speech and call upon the government whip to close the debate for GovBench.
there's an increasing number of young individuals who are relying on artificial intelligence from a very young age. They learn everything they know from it. The team who wins this debate is the team that proves who gets the greatest possible happiness for this group of individuals who already are facing a whole string of mental health crises. Consider the comparative, right? A young person uses an LLM for every instance of their daily life. But instead of allowing the access to this to happen, instead of making these things better and improving them, you put up barriers. You have worsening the mental crises because you have things like, sorry, bucko, that's not an appropriate question to be asking me that. You should keep that to yourself. I think the kind of behaviors we instill from a young age should be ones that are determined by the best possible manifestation of these AIs. We prove to you why we get the best possible manifestation. We have 5 mechanisms for this. First of all, we create a market demand at the point at which the rise is quite large. Secondarily, the AI hype and status quo means that the initial capital is very easy to get from venture capitalists or from the stock market in general. Finally, thirdly, you have a competitive incentive. But crucially, you want the perception of efficacy and your reputation of your AI to be quite good. So if you're competing for contracts, as for instance with Josh's law firm, all that kind of stuff means that you have an incentive to prove that you actually have efficacy, to have studies that prove that you're effective so that individuals don't expose themselves to lawsuits. Next, you have the increased funding for psychological research and university collaboration with, for instance, logicians, maybe ones who work on things like dynamic epistemic logics. Please, for the love of God, fund my research. Psychologists or computer scientists, all this kind of stuff means that you get more funding going into these industries at the point at which there's an increased source of revenue and a demand for the kind of things that they're willing to do with these studies, which means the kind of studies that the AIs are based on have, one, better access to good psychological mechanisms that don't just do what OO says and tell people the things they want to hear, but are actually better at working through these issues, will listen to people and give them genuinely good advice. These are independent benefits from the research. But finally, on preemptive regulation, Sachin's response to this is that no, Donald Trump has removed all the regulations, but companies still have an incentive not to get sued to death for having a kid kill themselves because of the things that they said to the AI, which means you're likely to impose preemptive regulation just as a financial incentive to begin with, which means you have an incentive to fund these kind of things as a safeguarding mechanism and to do this in the best possible way. Opening opposition says, AI isn't very good right now. We crucially solve this issue. Alishba notices this and says, there's kind of a short-term harm, but we wait for AI to become very good at this. But I'm not certain how to weigh this, because if we have the entire future and Alishba has a couple of years, I think we win on that. We get the greatest possible happiness. The next thing I'm going to do is go through both of the opposition cases, flatten them, tell you why they get no impacts from them, and then weigh our mechanisms against opening government's mechanisms. Opening opposition brings you 3.5 things in the first speech. First of all, the establishment that the comparative is venting to your friends and your family. There's a couple of problems with this. First of all, these individuals have limited time to tell you and to interact with you on a daily basis. Secondly, you often feel like a burden when you try to go to these individuals with every single issue that you face. Therefore, you're not likely able to do it to the same extent that you are with ChatGPT. Third, there are some subjects that you can't broach with them. For instance, you can't talk to your parents about things like sex or that kind of stuff. You can't talk to your friends about interpersonal issues that you're having with them themselves. LLMs don't have this problem, which means that these are not crucially the perfect arbiters that OO sets them up to be. What Alishba tells you is that you get this culture of active listening, meaning this is actually done quite well by these actors. But look, just because there's a lot of discourse around it doesn't mean that people are actually good at it. This is very hard to do, and individuals oftentimes just give unsolicited advice, as I said in the PY. Like, there's a lot of discourse around hockey during the playoffs, but I can't hit a slap shot like Marcus Naslund. Secondly, what Aymaan tells you is that this AI just essentially tells you what you want. First of all, this loses to our mechanisms on our own extension as to why this is done well. But secondarily, I think even if it just tells you what you want, I'm going to bite the bullet and tell you why this is still good. Why? Because you vent for catharsis. You just want your solvency for your pain. You just want someone to be there to give you a natural response to the things that you are telling it. The comparative, crucially, that Aymaan and Alishba set up is introspection, but oftentimes this worsens the issues because loneliness and unresolved pain also causes egoism, which note is the impact of this point. When you're dealing with your issues yourself, you feel like you're abandoned by the world. You feel resentment towards the world. That is when you come in deep with self-help cultures like incelism or femcelism, which are crucially worse ways of dealing with your problem. They never prove to you why introspection necessarily leads to you having good ways of dealing with your problems. And oftentimes advice just isn't what people want or need. Catharsis is all they need. Next thing they tell you is that advertisements and high trust means that you're likely to have high uptick on this. But if this is done anyway, we may as well increase the quality of it. Therefore, our extension defeats them on this as well. What the DLO brings to you is that, in fact, these are things that are not too expensive. There are things like charities and hotlines that are subsidized. But look, this therapy is bad. It's like the vulture organizations like BetterHelp, which have a couple of problems with this. First of all, these therapists you have very limited access to. It's 30-minute sessions per week, which are not enough for individuals to genuinely work through their goals as compared to LLMs, which are available all the time. Secondly, you feel as though the individual has a financial incentive the whole time. Note the employees of these charitable organizations are oftentimes students who haven't had the primary training on bedside manner, and you can tell that they're seeing 50 clients a day and are exhausted and are not crucially giving you the amount of time that you need. Third, you condense your issues for one 30-minute session, which means you don't talk about everything that you need to talk about, and you reduce yourself to something that is much smaller than you actually are. Fourth, you leave feeling like a product, like a faulty piece of machinery with a medical flaw, which means ultimately this does not work. Finally, on closing opposition, what do they tell you? First of all, they tell you that there's a culture, they try to do this analytical connection. They say, first of all, there's a culture of opening up, that your friends have proven to you that they've been good over time. But look, Sachin, you're a popular guy. You got a lot of friends. But the issue is, the key stakeholder in this debate is that there are many young people who have no friends and therefore lack the crucial capacity to do any of the things that you prove they have the incentive to do. I'll take the POI now.
Yeah, it's unclear whether this mental health AI will ever exist, as firms cannot justify supplying unregulated therapists, and there's no explanation on how these specialized LLMs actually work. The comparativist therapist can react to you in real time on the physical symptoms that you are exhibiting and guide you through a panic attack.
Okay. No, therapists can't react to you in real time because I've already framed you. They only speak to you once a week. And LLMs, we've already proven to you, have the incentive to fund research, which gives you good things to avoid legal action against them, which is crucially different from these therapists who just try to avoid accountability by not engaging with your problems at all, so they can't be sued for it. Okay, next thing Sachin tells you is that you rely on the culture that is developed by things like Reddit and online spaces, which tell you that it's good to vent about yourself. But these online spaces do bad things, right? They feed into the negative kind of cultures, like incel cultures, which means these things are done worse than perhaps that the LLMs are doing when they're legally responsible for the outcomes of these situations and have a competitive incentive to do it as best as possible. The online space has no regulation and does this worst of all. The next thing this section tells you is family. Again, this is derivative and I think loses to the same responses I already gave to Aymaan's point on this. Next, on privacy. Okay, first thing I want to note about privacy as an argument in debates is the most philosophically nebulous impact in the world. Crucially, all that Sachin's able to tell you is bad about it is like you get targeted ads. But weigh targeted ads against crucial solvency for individuals going through mental health crises all the time, this point cannot win even at its best. I'm not sure why individuals care about privacy when it's not proximate to them and don't even understand the harms of it. Next, on cybersecurity. This is just not unique compared to WhatsApp and Messenger, which crucially, the only mechanism Sachin gives you is that these things are on the cloud. Messenger and WhatsApp are also on the cloud and therefore expose you to the exact same vulnerabilities. It just comes with the territory of being online all the time. Finally, let's weigh our mechanisms against opening governments. Fraser gives you three mechanisms. First of all, there's three mechanisms for this being done well. First of all, massive investment, large regulation, and market incentives. But crucially, they never respond to the opening opposition good response, which is the reasonable response that it's a race to the bottom, that you normalize kind of giving just people what they want to hear. First of all, my response as to why giving people what they want to hear oftentimes is good beats this. But secondarily, our mechanisms are much more certain at getting you a version of the AI that gives you the best possible ways on this that are more certain than having the race to the bottom. Finally, on better solvency, what Fraser says about opening up, we normalize opening up from a very young age. We therefore have a greater margin on this as compared to Fraser's mechanisms.
I'd like to thank the government whip for that very fine speech and call upon the opposition whip to close the debate for Alt Bench and the debate as a whole.
I'm going to arrange my notes very quickly. Okay. Can I be seen and heard?
Yes.
I'll take a POI from OG. Three things in the speech. Firstly, on the comparative why we okay. Secondly, on how AI can never satisfy your physical needs, which explains why you don't get emotional fulfillment. Finally, on privacy and security and explaining why actually the harms are immensely damaging. Okay, one, on the comparative, what do we explain that uniquely helps us place over opening opposition? I think firstly, we give far more granular characterization about why there's an increase in recognition generally that psychological needs are serious and must be dealt with. What do these things look like in the status quo? I think one, it looks like a recognition that male loneliness is in fact a problem that a lot of men generally experience. It's the fact that a lot of individuals just tend to have very poor mental health as a result of the stresses of life. And note, I think this is an increasing trend that we uniquely can leverage on in the status quo that goes away with the reliance on AI as a method to solve your biggest qualms. Why is this the case? One, I think social media has reduced the fear of face-to-face contact. So all this stuff OG says about how you can't directly reach out to a person is mitigated by the fact that anonymity enables individuals to rationalize their feelings, get used to talking about the emotions, and even if it isn't as effective as what the AI suggests, it isn't the alternative isn't like all hope is lost under outside. But secondly, and more importantly, governments realize that this is a massive fucking issue. What this means is that they're more compelled to fund things like state-supported mental health services to increase accessibility because it's a very serious and prevalent issue that can't be ignored. But the second and more important contribution is that a trade-off exists in the realm. The rise necessitates less reliance on conventional methods of solving your problems, and opening government's problem statement feeds into this. If you are afraid about humans, you naturally trust the AI more. The fear never goes away because the AI always offers you comfort. You prefer to stay with what you know will guarantee you safety. The implication here is quite clear. If the AI is seen as the solution to your massive psychological needs, there's less of a need to do things like find conventional means of dealing with support. Things like therapy services, talking to your friends, and normalizing a culture of actually talking about your feelings through things like information campaigns. More importantly, if closing government is correct in saying that you use AI in every element of your life, this nice opening government because they say actually you're not going to use the AI that extensively. Okay, why is the AI inherently problematic? And I like to know, I think this automatically beats out opening opposition because this claim is independent of any malice in the AI development. What we explain, which is pretty fucking important, is that the AI is structurally incapable of giving you a holistic solution. Why? The data is entirely based on a unilateral account of your own individual problems. What this means is it's very individualistic. It's one-sided. People don't like affixing blame on themselves, so they reconstruct the narrative, even if not intentionally, subconsciously to make themselves not seem like the bad guy. What this means then is that the AI prescribes to you a very individualistic solution that doesn't necessarily work in the network of relationships that you exist in. When two people have an AI solution that is just self-affirming, there's obviously going to be a clash because you don't work towards the middle to make a compromise. This also beats out closing government's claim of like specialized AI for the most niche of problems because we need to look at the data input. One, it's regular individuals. Oftentimes you don't have the most accurate diagnoses of your conditions. I'm a regular Joe like you and I. We aren't a licensed therapist who knows how to accurately assess how we feel. What this means then is that you tend to overcompensate. You hyperbolize your conditions, saying I'm depressed as opposed to sad, saying I'm anxious as opposed to nervous. What this means then is that the AI is far more likely to medicalize your conditions and prescribe to you things like medicine. Note, this is independent of AI developers wanting to compete to produce better mechanisms because it's all contingent on users engaging in flawed data input. That is why the solutions are bad on their side. Secondly, on how AI can never satisfy your physical needs. So I think opening government just automatically concedes to this entirely when they accept the AI is imperfect. It can't give you a hug. It can't give you the human touch that affirms your feelings in the present. The implication of this is quite deadly. It's that people feel immensely incomplete under their house, even if you're given a solution. Why does this prevent the successful execution of the AI strategy? And note, even if GovBench can prove that the AI gives you good solutions, they don't say why it's going to manifest well. One, you're inherently sad. Insofar as you're emotionally unsatisfied, you aren't in an optimal condition to execute the strategy properly. Secondly, cognitive dissonance. So AI prescribes two separate individual strategies because you don't engage in a concentration back and forth dialogue. You don't arrive at a middle ground where both parties can mutually understand and come to a compromise. The nuance of our case is not the bad advice makes you go and kill yourself, it's that the bad advice self-affirms and prevents yourself from introspecting and you don't actually get tangible beneficial outcomes on their side. On the impacts, specifically regarding immediate catharsis, I think what is far better than words are actions. Feeling a hug in the moment, seeing your friend's facial reactions that acknowledge your suffering, all of these things cannot be replicated through words, which is why I think is an experience about going through your feelings is just fundamentally better on our side. Before I move on to privacy and security, OG.
Not only is it the case that if the alternative is you sitting on your own, you get the same problems of self-affirmation, but these AIs are likely to be able to ask pushing questions. That's something that people are likely to respond to, so it's probably coded in.
One, the counterfactual is not people sit alone. We explain why oftentimes a vast majority of individuals do exist within a constellation of other individuals, which isn't as daunting of reaching out. I think you hyperbolize the problem. Lastly, on privacy and security, what do we prove? One, you're unable to regulate AI extensively for three reasons. A, LLMs are uniquely reliant on flexibility and having the ability to operate without strict controls. The stricter you want regulation, the more you undermine the efficacy of the AI to evolve very quickly. Secondly, AI developers already extensively lobby to ensure the industry has deregulation. Even if you don't buy that and you can regulate, regulations are made by people who just don't know how the AI works. Just the black box problem with AI, right? Even the most advanced of developers don't know how the AI arrives at its conclusions, right? You don't understand the intricacies of the AI. So even if you know the AI is bad, you don't know where to specifically intervene to correct the problem, which is why you don't get the solvency and improvement under their side of the house. If people want the AI to be effective, they need to feed more and more of their own personal data into it. And this is where we deal with opening government's assertion, right? That, companies have your data on our side. One, The status quo suspicion of data misuse only exists when there isn't a widespread use of AI to such an intimate degree. We preserve things like the skepticism of things like Cambridge Analytica. Secondly, WhatsApp is literally fucking encrypted. Don't lie to me, opening government. Thirdly, this is uncomparative. On their side, you directly reveal your greatest insecurities to the AI, whereas on our side, at best, the company needs to infer what your insecurities are based on your text messages. What are the harms? One, the moment you consent to giving your data, companies can do whatever the fuck they want with it. And their Hail Mary response is that you can sue. The issue is that it's very difficult to prove causation, that the advice caused you harm compared to when you're talking to things like a licensed therapist. And note, the harm here is massive. You lose control over how your data is constructed. You lose the ability to live a dignified life. Uncertainly, we prove that the severeness of the harms are massive compared to the nebulous benefit of some sort of comfort. For all those reasons, the human input is irreplaceable. Cyber CEO.
I'd like to thank the opposition whip for that excellent speech. Everybody thought it was a fantastic debate. Please leave this room so that we can deliberate, and we'll get back to you with the call
Thank you.
after we've decided.